Hello, I'm Elias, and I'd like to talk about one or two items connected with the Admiral Lord Nelson. I'm based in Dorking, where I used to run a business specialising in antique desks and writing furniture. At that time, I heard about a desk with connections to Lord Nelson, and that particularly interested me. It's this desk here, and as with a lot of things connected with Nelson, there's a lot of research that needs to be done, as there's lots of fakes, forgeries, misleading articles and things written about it. In Dorking in particular, we have a history known to be associated with the last days of Nelson, which, when I was doing research into Nelson pieces and the Nelson history in particular, I found to be an error. I have published the article which was accepted by the Nelson Dispatch, the journal about Nelson, and also our local museums. I'd be happy to give people a copy of that if they're interested. As regards research about different Nelson pieces, one tries to take as much information as possible from marks, labels. This desk has a brass plate on the back, and also what is said to be the history of Nelson. This desk actually was owned by Edmund Nelson, that was Nelson's father. There was a fair bit of information about when it was produced and on what occasion, and there have been various debates and perhaps criticisms that this wasn't Nelson's desk, or it wasn't directly connected, because Edmund Nelson was at a church near Burnham Thorpe, and why would he be given a desk by the parishioners, which is what it says on the back, and what age the desk is, and if the carving was traditional from Norfolk, or whether the actual desk dates from before the period, and it was thought to be given to Edmund Nelson. There's various reasons why I think it's legitimate, and the arguments as to why it is so special and unique. Edmund Nelson did travel quite widely, and towards the end of his life he had certain infirmities, possibly because Norfolk was quite a damp country, and he did go quite often to Bath to recover, and I'd like to think that this desk is the sort that he might have taken with him. Within the desk, when I purchased it, it had these different items which were said to have been from HMS Victory, and I've researched at Portsmouth as to whether these are the right age and style, and what any specialist will be able to say is they're the right period, they're the right style, but at that time there would have been hundreds of ships which would have had old items like these, which could easily have been given or used or said this is like the one at Nelson's ship, and being associated, and there's no way of proving that. There is an item on here that has written saying that it came from HMS Victory, but again that's not really any proof. It's a sort of background. I've researched the carving and the style and the age and other things to do with the desk. That's probably as much as I could perhaps just show you inside the desk. It's got a panel that lifts up, well, we won't do that for the moment. But on the back of the desk, shall I turn this around?
Bring the camera forward.
On the back of the desk there's a brass plate commemorating that it was given to Edmund Nelson by his parishioners, and there has been research done on the printing, and I've had great help from a Graham Capel, who is connected, I believe, with the Nelson Society. He has serious doubts about the desk, and he did mention that the printing is not contemporary with the style of printing that would have been used, and he's got some other arguments that question the story of the desk, but with a lot of Nelson pieces that will often be the case, and I can point out some of the others on the other items which I'd like to show you. I bought Edmund Nelson's desk about 20 years ago. It was at a sale, I think, in the Midlands. It was actually part of the Whitbread archives. Whitbread is a brewing firm, and they, for their publicity, they bought various items connected with Nelson for promotion of things like Nelson gin or Trafalgar ales, or things with a naval interesting historical background. And I think at that time they bought many items that they wanted to own or use in their publicity. With regard to the desk, that was something which I heard about and bought and then researched, and it was only after I've done a lot of background interest into where it came from, where it might have been used. One can never be too exact, or one has to accept that a lot of it needs to be proved, or has to bear an element of uncertainty. But at that sale there was also a sale of one of Nelson's swords. After the sale, or perhaps in the year or so afterwards, I regretted not having looked at the sword as well or pursued it, but it was particularly the desk that was mainly of interest to me. But it did then come for sale a bit later, which is often the case where someone purchases and finds it's not quite what they want, or they might have doubts about the provenance or the story or the background, but which enabled me anyway, when it came on the market again, to take a lot closer interest in it, and then I bought that at the time. For me, it has a lot of interest, partly tying in with the story of Nelson, because with regards to Edmund Nelson, when he died, he had stayed with Nelson at their house at Merton, and I like to think that he might have travelled with the desk, or when he actually died a bit later in Bath, he had Nelson didn't attend the funeral, and so there was a gap as to why Nelson would have inherited it, as Nelson had his brother William alive at the time, and why would one person receive it and another, and things like Edmund Nelson's will wasn't specific, although on the background to the sword and the desk, it was said that they had been purchased from the Merton Place sale. As regards the background to the sword, I have this came with the sale, which is a letter of a sworn affidavit, and it also mentions when the Nelson sword first came on the market. It was at Sotheby's it's got a date on there, but I can't decipher that for the moment. But it gives a bit about the background and the sword mender that Nelson is said to have taken it to. And again, there's why would he have taken it to this sword dealer, why the background to this is likely to be true. But there's a lot more research one can always do, and one can take one's own opinion as to whether they think it's correct or not. It is, the sword itself is a Georgian naval sword. It has an unusual ivory grip, and this is said to be like the ship's lantern that they would have had on board ship. The actual style is very much in keeping. It has on the I'll show you on the design, I don't know if you can see that, and the details on the handle clasp. It's also got the what's called a fouled anchor. That apparently is significant. I have taken this sword to Westminster Abbey, where they have a museum with an effigy of Lord Nelson, and it's noticeable that their sword, I understand, this is a better example of more likely to be the original sword that Nelson would have had. There is a history as to why it was brought to the swordsmith for repair, and it to me, the story as to why Nelson would take it to that sword mender rather than to Salters, which were his chosen or usual swordsmith. But it was at a time where Nelson was travelling quite a bit, and he was sometimes gone from these shores for many months or even 2 or 3 years at times, and I think it's quite conceivable he might have taken it to somewhere and then not returned, or maybe not been able to recover it when he would expect it to. I think that's, if you're able to finish that, I can show you a grandfather clock with associations, more not from Nelson's period, but from a collector's point of view, that might be of interest. This is the clock that is commemorating Nelson. It has a very decorative dial. It is a Georgian clock, and what is particularly nice about it is that the features are particularly, it has in the top dial, it has Lady Hamilton holding a portrait of Lord Nelson. It also has ships, the Victory painted, and a picture of the lion and a bird, a seer, in the dial. Around the Victorian period, there were quite a lot of painters, decorators that were following the trend of decorating things in memory of Nelson, and this particular artist was quite important, even though it looks fairly crude. I had the benefit of Rory McAvoy, who is from the Maritime Observatory Museum, who wanted to come up and take details of it, and he's included it in part of his well, he wrote on many Nelson commemorative items, and this part is included in one of his books or writings. It's a lovely detailed mahogany case. It's in full working order, being restored, and this is one that I hope to be selling. I've got many items, or some small insignificant maybe, like Nelson head, posters and various things that I will be wanting to sell individually, but I also would like to give someone the opportunity of buying everything if that is what someone would be interested in. Of the smaller items that I could mention, I've obviously got the bust of Nelson, the posters, but quite unusually I have brass Nelson handles. Perhaps I can show those outside, which I'll do now. Some years ago I also managed to buy some Nelson handles. They're brass. I've got a choice of 3. I've got perhaps 2 sets of 6 or 8, but I also at the time had some casts, some moulds made of each of these handles. So these I am looking to see if someone is interested in being able to cast their own handles, which they are quite in detail, that they give a very solid impression, and the solid brass, it finishes and it gets a very nice detail, and it shows that this one, England expects every man to do his duty. And also with Trafalgar and the date of the Battle of Trafalgar on there. Well, that's we've got other items as I mentioned, but if anyone is interested in any or the collection, I'd be very pleased to hear from them. Thank you.